This is the true story of how a quiet man in worn boots and a weathered green jacket stepped off an international flight and shattered the illusion of what power is supposed to look like. He carried only a single black duffel, no designer luggage, no entourage. To airport security, he was just another anonymous traveler, someone easy to overlook or dismiss. But what they didn't realize was that this man would, within hours, ignite a firestorm that would ripple from Washington to West Africa. A moment of quiet profiling would expose a system built not on truth but on appearances, and behind those appearances, a secret the world wasn't ready for. It all began in the sterile, humming haze of Terminal C. The overhead lights buzzed with that familiar artificial glow that makes every airport feel like the same nowhere. Flight 764 from Dakar had just landed, and the passengers trickled out, bleary-eyed, heavy-legged, yet alert with anticipation. Among them was a man who, by noon, would no longer be a nobody. At 11:47 a.m. on a cold Tuesday morning, Ibrahim Traoré stood calmly in line at U.S. immigration, unnoticed by nearly everyone. The terminal was a blur of movement and noise. Rolling carts, boarding calls in 6 languages, conversations drowned in white noise. Behind the immigration counter was Officer James Mitchell, a 6-year veteran at the arrivals desk. That day felt like every other: passport, question, stamp, repeat. He'd already processed about 40 travelers, each one more forgettable than the last. But then came the man in the old boots. Mitchell noticed him the way you'd notice a still lake in the middle of a storm. Not flashy, just quiet, still, grounded. His clothes were unremarkable, his posture calm, but something felt off. Not wrong, just different. He wore no watch, no labels, just that fraying green jacket and well-worn boots that had clearly walked more miles than most of the business class crowd could imagine. His bag was a basic duffel, no wheels, no locks, no branding. He stepped up to the desk, placed the bag down gently, and reached into his pocket. His movements were slow, almost ceremonial. From inside the jacket, he pulled out a burgundy passport and placed it on the counter. "Good morning," he said, his voice calm, edged with a faint accent. West African, perhaps. Mitchell opened the passport and read the name Ibrahim Traoré. The photo matched, but as his eyes scanned the rest of the document, something didn't sit right. Official title: Diplomat. Mitchell blinked. Diplomatic passport. He glanced back up at the man. He didn't look like a diplomat. He didn't carry himself like the power players who usually swept through with security details and VIP clearance, and yet here he was, stating his purpose as simply official business. Mitchell's instincts, trained to detect inconsistencies, kicked in. "What kind of official business?" he asked, voice firm. But the man didn't flinch. "Meetings with your State Department," he replied, steady. "Details are classified." The officer studied him. No nerves, no arrogance, just quiet certainty. And that's when Mitchell felt it. Not fear, not suspicion, but the unsettling sense that he was standing in front of someone very important, someone whose identity had been hidden, not because it was false, but because revealing it would change everything. Within hours, the terminal would become the scene of a diplomatic standoff. Within days, headlines would explode. And within weeks, the world would be forced to confront the uncomfortable truth. Power doesn't always wear a suit. Sometimes it walks through customs in worn boots and silence. I have meetings scheduled at the United Nations. That's when Mitchell's confusion turned into quiet alarm. The UN? He glanced back at the burgundy passport in his hands, this time reading it more carefully. He'd skimmed it earlier, assuming it was just another diplomat from somewhere overseas. But now he focused. Issued by Burkina Faso. Somewhere in West Africa, he thought. But the real shock wasn't the country. It was the title. "Sir," he said slowly, "this passport lists your occupation as president." The man nodded once. "That is correct." No hesitation, no arrogance, no trace of defensiveness, just calm, steady certainty. The same tone someone might use to confirm their date of birth. And that made it worse. Mitchell had processed countless VIPs, ministers, governors, even a former prime minister. They never traveled alone. There were always aides, protocol officers, security teams, private drivers, and people hovering with phones and briefcases. This man, he looked like a high school teacher on holiday. Or maybe someone returning home after years abroad. Nothing about him screamed power or politics. "You're telling me you're the president of Burkina Faso?" Mitchell asked again, narrowing his eyes. "I am." There it was again, that unshakable calm, not boastful, not annoyed, just certain, as if this wasn't news, as if he didn't need to prove anything. But it didn't add up. Presidents don't fly commercial without a team. They don't stand in line with tourists. And they certainly don't wear jackets with frayed cuffs and carry bags that look like they've been around the world twice. "I'm going to need you to wait right here for a moment," Mitchell said, keeping his tone neutral as he picked up the phone. The man nodded politely, stepped aside, and leaned against the wall without protest. No pacing, no phone checking, no anxious glances. He just waited. Mitchell kept him in his peripheral vision as he called for backup. "Mike, it's Mitchell, Window 7. I've got something strange here. I think you'd better come down." 10 minutes later, Supervisor Mike Torres arrived along with Officer Sarah Chen. That was already a sign that this wasn't being taken lightly. "What's the story?" Torres asked. Mitchell handed over the passport. "He claims he's the president of Burkina Faso, says he's in New York for UN meetings." Torres looked from the passport to the man by the wall. "Has he been cooperative?" "Completely. Calm. No issues. But look at him, Mike. Does that look like a president to you?" Torres turned. The man was still waiting where he'd been told, hands folded, back straight. A child nearby dropped a plastic toy airplane. The man bent slowly, handed it back to the boy with a gentle smile. No grand gesture, just a small act of kindness. Torres watched the moment, then murmured, "I don't know what a president's supposed to look like, but I know a fake passport when I see one." "Chen?" he asked, holding the document toward her. Officer Chen took the passport and examined it with the precision of someone who'd handled thousands. She checked the microprint, held it up to the light, felt the texture, scanned the holograms. After a few tense minutes, she looked up. "It's real, genuine diplomatic passport, Burkina Faso. All the security features check out." Mitchell raised an eyebrow. "So he really is the president?" Chen shrugged. "The passport says so. Whether that's the whole story, that's someone else's call." Torres exhaled. "All right, let's take him to secondary screening, quietly." They approached him. He was now helping a woman nearby lift her suitcase onto a bench. She thanked him in Spanish. He replied fluently, asking if she needed anything else. Torres stepped forward. "Sir, I'm Supervisor Torres. We'd like to have a quick word in private, if that's all right." The man stood, picked up his bag, and nodded. Of course. They led him down a back hallway, away from the noise of the terminal, to a private secondary screening room, small, quiet, designed for discretion, a table, a few chairs, a window with a view of the tarmac. "Please," Torres said, gesturing to a seat. The man sat calmly, his hands folded again, posture steady. Torres sat across from him. Years in law enforcement had taught him how to read people: liars, smugglers, panicked travelers. But this man, he wasn't giving away anything. No panic, no ego, just waiting. "I'm going to be honest with you," Torres began. "Your passport says you're the president of Burkina Faso, but you're traveling alone. No security, no staff, and, respectfully, you don't match what we expect from a head of state." The man listened in silence, then nodded, inviting Torres to continue. "So, here's where we are. We need to verify your identity. Can you provide contact information for your embassy or any documentation that confirms who you are?" The man reached slowly into his bag and placed a sealed envelope on the table. Inside, a personal letter of invitation from the UN Secretary-General. Signed, stamped. "I understand your position," the man said calmly, his voice as composed now as it had been at the immigration desk. "I can provide contact details for my diplomatic staff, but I should tell you, I prefer to travel simply. I am not fond of ceremony or heavy security. I believe a leader should walk among people, not above them, without barriers." It was a thoughtful, almost poetic answer, and Torres appreciated the sentiment, but it didn't solve the problem. "With respect, sir, we still need to verify your identity. It's standard protocol for any diplomatic passport holder." The man nodded and reached slowly into his worn jacket. No sudden movements, just deliberate, unbothered composure. He pulled out a modest smartphone, not a flagship model, not an encrypted government device, just an ordinary phone scratched along the sides like one you'd find in the back pocket of a school teacher. He scrolled for a moment and then turned the screen toward Torres. "This is the direct line for my chief of staff. He can confirm who I am." Torres hesitated and then took the phone and dialed. It rang several times before a voice answered in French, fast, formal, and slightly alarmed. Torres didn't speak French, so he handed the phone to Officer Chen, who had studied it in college. The conversation lasted 5 tense minutes. Chen asked measured questions. The voice on the other end answered quickly, almost urgently. When she hung up, her expression was unreadable. "Well?" Torres asked. Chen took a breath. "The man says he's President Troy's chief of staff. He confirmed the president is scheduled to speak at a UN session today. He asked if there was a problem and whether the president was being treated respectfully. I told him this was just a routine security check. He understood, but asked that we continue with diplomatic courtesy." Torres rubbed the back of his neck. The situation was no longer just a strange encounter. It was becoming a diplomatic tightrope. If this man really was the president of Burkina Faso, detaining him like a suspected fraud could have serious consequences. But if they let him pass on a phone call and it turned out he wasn't who he claimed to be, that might be even worse. "I need to make some calls," Torres said. He turned to the man. "Sir, I'm going to ask you to remain here while we sort this out. Can I get you anything? Water? Coffee?" "Water would be appreciated," the man replied with a polite nod. "Thank you." Torres left Officer Chen in the room and stepped out to his office to begin calling everyone who might have answers. First, the State Department's Diplomatic Security Office. Then, the United Nations Liaison Division. Then, his own chain of command. Each call led to another call, more questions, more verifications. And with each conversation, Torres could feel the weight of the situation growing. Meanwhile, back in the secondary screening room, Officer Chen was trying to make conversation with the man who, if his documents were real, was one of the most powerful people in West Africa. "So," she said, breaking the silence, "you're going to the UN?" "Yes," he replied without hesitation. "There's a session on sustainable development. I'm scheduled to address the assembly." "That sounds important." "It is. The policies we shape there will impact millions. Farmers who need water, children who need schools, mothers who need access to basic health care. These aren't abstract debates. They're real consequences for real lives." Chen wasn't expecting such a sincere answer. No rehearsed jargon, no ego, just quiet purpose. "What's Burkina Faso like?" she asked. The man's expression softened. "It's a beautiful country, humble, proud. We face struggles, poverty, healthcare gaps, security concerns, but we also have extraordinary potential. We have young minds eager to build, artists sharing our stories, people who rise every day with hope despite it all. We are imperfect, but we are rising." Chen studied his face. There was no vanity there, just conviction and something else, humility. "And you are the president?" she asked gently. "I am," he said, looking her in the eyes. "I came to office through difficult circumstances, but I serve with one goal: to lead with honesty, not for power, for change." Now she understood. The old jacket, the single bag, the absence of a security detail. He didn't need to look presidential. He was a leader, in the way that mattered. Just then, Torres returned with news that shifted everything. "Sir, I've spoken to the State Department and the UN. They've confirmed it. You are President Ibrahim Traoré of Burkina Faso. Your address at the UN is scheduled today." The man offered a small nod, calm, as if he already knew. But Torres wasn't finished. "There's a complication." The man's eyebrows lifted slightly. "Yes?" "While we were verifying your identity, someone on your flight recognized you. She recorded the entire encounter. It's already online." For the first time, the president's expression changed. Not anger, not fear. Just the tired sigh of someone who had seen this before. A flicker of disappointment, less in the officers than in the world. "Filming," he repeated softly. "Of course." He didn't ask to see the footage. He didn't protest. He simply looked out the small window, watching the planes come and go, and said quietly, "Sometimes the truth has to travel the long way." "Since we brought you to this room," Torres said, his voice tight, "the video's already gone viral." He pulled out his phone and turned the screen toward the man. It was a Twitter thread, posted just 30 minutes ago. The first tweet read, "Watching JFK security detain the president of Burkina Faso like he's a common criminal. This is racism in real time. This is what happens when you judge a man by his clothes, not his credentials. Hashtag diplomatic disgrace." Attached were grainy videos showing the man being quietly escorted through the terminal, followed by stills of his diplomatic passport. The tweet had already been retweeted hundreds of times, and the comments were multiplying by the second. "Is this real? They're detaining a sitting president? Embarrassing. Do better, America." Would they have done this to a European leader? Let's be honest. President Traoré is one of West Africa's most respected voices. This is a disgrace. The man took the phone gently, scrolled silently through a few replies, then handed it back. "This is unfortunate," he said, voice barely above a whisper. "I had hoped to avoid an incident." "Sir," Torres said, his voice now edged with guilt, With respect, you didn't cause this. We did. And now, we have to figure out how to make it right." Torres was already picturing the fallout, urgent calls from the State Department, internal reviews, press inquiries, maybe even his own suspension. One misunderstanding broadcast to the world. And now, the world was watching. "What would you like us to do?" "I would like to complete my entry and attend my scheduled meetings," the man replied with calm clarity. "I understand you were doing your job. I bear no anger toward you or your colleagues, but I do hope this becomes a moment of learning." "A learning moment?" "Yes. Perhaps now people will see that dignity and respect must not be tied to appearance or wealth or how many bodyguards one brings. A person's worth is not found in their suit, but in their service." Torres felt those words land in his chest like a quiet blow. This man wasn't lecturing. He wasn't angry. He was disappointed. And somehow, that was worse. "May I ask something, sir?" Torres said carefully. "Are you angry about how you were treated?" The man paused, thoughtful. Then he replied, "No, I am not angry. I am disappointed, not in you, but in the system that made this experience inevitable. I am disappointed that in 2024 an African diplomatic passport still invites suspicion, that respect is extended to power, not to principle, that people still look for status before they see humanity." Torres had nothing to say. There was no defense. But the man continued, "Still, I am hopeful. I believe this can start conversations that need to happen, that someone, somewhere, will examine their assumptions, and that the next African leader who passes through this terminal will not be treated as I was." Torres nodded slowly, his decision clear now. "Sir, I'll personally escort you through the rest of the entry process, and I'll make sure you receive the diplomatic courtesy you should have received from the very beginning." "That is not necessary." "With respect, sir, it is. For you, for us, for everyone watching." As they prepared to leave the screening room, Torres's phone buzzed. A message from his supervisor. "CNN is calling. They want a statement on the Troy incident. Call me now." Torres showed the screen to President Troy. The man looked down, exhaled slowly. "It has begun," he murmured. And he was right. This was no longer about a quiet misunderstanding in a terminal. It had become a story about dignity, power, race, and the silent assumptions that still govern how people are treated. By the time they returned to the terminal floor, a crowd had already gathered. Some were passengers who had recognized him from the video. Others were airport staff who had heard whispers. But what Torres saw next would stay with him forever. President Troy didn't ignore them. He didn't retreat or demand space. He walked calmly through the crowd, shaking hands, answering questions, offering smiles. One woman, teary-eyed and ashamed, approached him. "Mr. President," she said, her voice cracking, "I'm so sorry for how you were treated. This isn't who we're supposed to be." He took her hand gently and replied, "Thank you for your kindness, but please don't judge your country by this one moment. Judge it by how it responds to this moment. Judge it by what it learns and how it grows." And with that, he turned toward the exit, toward the world stage, toward the United Nations. And behind him, in that echoing terminal, silence lingered, filled not with shame, but with the quiet, powerful possibility of change. As they approached the terminal's final checkpoint, an airport worker stepped forward hesitantly. "Sir, I just wanted to say, not all of us think like that. Some of us still believe in treating people with respect." The president turned to him, eyes kind. He said, "I believe that. I believe most people, when given the chance, will choose kindness over suspicion, understanding over judgment. That belief, that belief is what gives me hope." Torres walked beside him in silence, the weight of the past few hours pressing heavier with each step. He knew this moment would follow him, for the rest of his career, maybe the rest of his life. But what stayed with him more than the headlines or the chaos was the lesson. At the exit gate, Torres stopped. "Sir," he said, voice quieter now, "I want to apologize again, for all of it. You've been more gracious than we deserved." President Traoré nodded slowly. "Thank you. But remember, this was never about me. It's about the next traveler who doesn't look like your idea of a diplomat. It's about the next passport from a country you've never heard of. It's about creating a world where people are treated with dignity, by default, not suspicion." Torres swallowed hard, unable to find the words to respond. As the president walked through the exit gate, Officer Chen stepped up beside him. She had been quiet, observant through the final exchange. "You know," she said, watching Troy disappear into the crowd, "I think we just met a real leader." Torres glanced at her. "What do you mean?" "I mean someone who had every reason to make this worse and chose to make it better. Someone who could have demanded apologies and headlines, but chose to leave us with a lesson instead." Torres swallowed hard, nodding slowly. "Yeah, I think we just learned what dignity actually looks like." Neither of them spoke again as they returned to their stations, lost in thought. They didn't know that this moment, quiet, painful, unexpected, would ripple far beyond JFK Airport, that it would lead to revisions in diplomatic screening policy, that it would spark internal reviews on unconscious bias, that it would be studied in future training seminars as an example of leadership under pressure. All they knew was this: they had just witnessed something rare. A man who turned disrespect into grace, who responded to suspicion with wisdom, who transformed a mistake into a moment of humanity. Outside, President Traoré stepped into a taxi. The driver glanced back through the rear-view mirror. "Hey, are you that president they were talking about on the news? The one who got stopped at the airport?" "I am." "Man," the driver said, shaking his head, "that's messed up. I'm sorry that happened to you." "Thank you," Troy replied gently, "but it wasn't your fault." "Still, makes us look bad. Embarrassing." The president leaned forward slightly. "May I tell you something?" "Of course." "The way a country looks is not judged by its worst moments. It is judged by how it responds to them, by how it learns, by how it grows." The driver nodded, eyes on the road. "That's a good way to look at it." "It's the only way. Otherwise, we'd all be prisoners of our mistakes, instead of authors of our progress." As the taxi pulled away from the terminal, President Traoré glanced out the window one last time. He thought about the young officer who had asked him sincere questions, about the woman who had apologized on behalf of a nation, about the man who reminded him that compassion still lived in unexpected places, and most of all, he thought about his speech the next day at the United Nations. He had come to speak about sustainable development. Now he would also speak about something deeper, about dignity, about the cost of assumption, and about the quiet, revolutionary power of choosing grace when no one would have blamed you for choosing fury. Outside, the noise and energy of New York City, President Traoré sat quietly in the back seat, phone in hand. With a few calm taps, he composed a single tweet, simple, sincere, and destined to echo far beyond the platform. Today, I experienced a moment of misunderstanding, but I also witnessed kindness, curiosity, and the will to do better. That is what I will remember. That is what gives me hope. Build bridges. Choose understanding. The tweet was posted just as the car pulled up outside his hotel in Midtown Manhattan. By the time he'd checked in and reached his room, it had been shared 500 times. By the time he went to bed, it had crossed 10,000. But President Traoré wasn't thinking about numbers or hashtags or headlines. He was thinking about the next day's speech, about the conversation still to come, about the silent work of building a better world, not through outrage, but through reflection. He thought about the idea of dignity not as something fragile or borrowed, but something born from within, something unshakable, something that shows its true strength when it is tested. The next morning, at 10 a.m. sharp, President Traoré took the stage at the United Nations General Assembly. The hall was packed. 193 member nations sat in their assigned seats, translators murmuring quietly in glass booths. But this time, there was an uncommon stillness in the air. The airport story had already circulated through diplomatic circles overnight. Everyone was waiting. Traoré approached the podium wearing the same worn green jacket from the day before. No designer suit, no dramatic change in presentation, just deliberate continuity, a message in fabric. He began. Excellencies, distinguished delegates, friends, I stand before you today not only as the President of Burkina Faso, but as a man who, just yesterday, learned how quickly assumptions can define an experience and how dignity can redefine it. The hall went silent. Even the usual rustling of notes stopped. Yesterday, I was detained at your airport, not because I broke a law or presented a threat, but because I did not look like what airport security expected a president to look like. I was judged not by my credentials, but by my coat, not by my purpose, but by my appearance. He paused, letting the words land. I could use this moment to express anger, to demand apologies, to score political points, but that would be a missed opportunity, because what this moment truly offers is a mirror for all of us. In the U.S. delegation's row, Ambassador Rachel Morrison shifted uncomfortably. She had spent the previous night in back-to-back calls with the State Department. A formal apology had already been issued, but she knew words in a press release wouldn't erase what the world had already seen. President Traoré continued, "How many times do we judge someone by their skin, their accent, their clothing? How many doors have we closed, not with malice, but with assumptions?" He moved slowly across the room, making quiet contact with representatives from every corner of the globe. Burkina Faso is not the global superpower. We struggle with poverty. We face security challenges. But yesterday, I learned something about power that is not measured in armies or budgets. I learned the power of grace in the face of suspicion, of choosing patience over pride, of turning discomfort into dialogue. In the press gallery above, journalists leaned forward. Some scribbled notes, others simply watched, quiet. What they had expected was a policy speech. What they were witnessing was something deeper, something human. The officers who detained me were not cruel, They were doing their jobs, but their training was shaped by a belief, conscious or not, that a leader must look a certain way, carry a certain posture, speak a certain language. He paused again. That belief is not unique to one airport. It lives in many of our systems, in immigration desks, in boardrooms, in our own minds. The solution is not anger. It is awareness. It is empathy. It is changing the training, yes, but more than that, changing the lens through which we see the world. In the seats, some ambassadors nodded. Others sat motionless, listening. This is not a story about airport security. It is a story about how quickly we forget that leadership comes in many forms, that dignity does not require a motorcade, that respect should not depend on appearance. He closed his speech with the same calm resolve he had carried from the beginning. If we want a world that is truly just, truly united, then we must begin by seeing one another fully, not through the filter of fear or familiarity, but through the deeper truth that every person deserves dignity by default. I thank you. There was a beat of silence. Then the chamber erupted into applause, not out of obligation, but from the recognition of something real, something rare. A man had been judged at the border of a nation, and had responded not with rage, but with resolve. President Traoré stepped away from the podium slightly, his voice steady, his presence calm. "How many of you," he asked, scanning the room, "have made similar assumptions?" The silence was immediate. How many of you have judged a fellow leader based on their clothing, their accent, their country's GDP, their ability to project power in the traditional sense? The question wasn't an accusation. It was an invitation, a mirror held gently before the world's most powerful gathering. I'm not here to shame anyone, nor to claim some moral high ground. I'm here because we all have blind spots. We all carry bias, and that means each of us also has the opportunity to do better. From his jacket, he pulled a small folded note. "This morning," he said, holding it up, "I received this message from Officer Torres, the supervisor who oversaw my detention yesterday at JFK. He wrote, 'Mr. President, thank you for teaching me that dignity is not about demanding respect, but about maintaining it, even when it's not given. I will carry that lesson with me for the rest of my career.'" President Traoré folded the paper, tucked it away, and looked out at the crowd. "This," he said, quietly, "is what matters. Not the mistake itself, but what we learn from it. Not the misunderstanding, but the deeper understanding it makes possible." He stepped forward, his tone turning more personal. "In my country, there's a saying, 'The tree that bends in the wind does not break.' Yesterday, I could have broken. I could have escalated. I could have demanded my release, summoned diplomats, made threats, and turned the situation into an international crisis." A beat. "But I chose to bend. I chose to wait with patience, to answer questions calmly, to offer the same dignity I hoped to receive. And in that moment, I realized dignity is not something anyone can take from you. It is something you carry inside, something that rises to meet the moment, that reshapes conflict into connection." The applause began softly, scattered claps from a few corners of the room, but it spread quickly. Within seconds, the entire hall was standing. Diplomats, ambassadors, heads of state, all rising in recognition of something not just rare, but real. When the room finally quieted again, President Traoré nodded in gratitude and said, "Now, let me tell you why I came here today." Not, he clarified, to talk about border protocols or personal frustrations, but to speak about sustainable development, international solidarity, and the urgent work that unites us all. For the next 30 minutes, he laid out detailed proposals to address climate adaptation, water security, education for displaced youth, and access to healthcare across rural regions. But woven through every point was a single thread: understanding. He spoke not as a leader scolding the world, but as one inviting it to see itself more clearly and to act more compassionately. By the end of his address, the atmosphere in the General Assembly had transformed. Delegates didn't just applaud, they approached. One by one, they lined up, not for photo ops, but to shake his hand, to speak, to ask questions, to offer collaboration. Among the first was UN Secretary-General Antonio Guterres. "Mr. President," he said, "you've turned a diplomatic embarrassment into a global education. You've shown us what real leadership looks like." "Thank you," President Traoré replied with a modest smile, "but remember, this is not about me. It's about all of us choosing to do better." Later that afternoon, at a press conference buzzing with international media, the first question came from a CNN reporter. "Mr. President, will you be filing a formal complaint about what happened at JFK?" "No," Traoré replied simply. "That would serve no constructive purpose. The officers involved were doing their jobs as they understood them. What matters now is how we learn and how we grow." A BBC journalist followed up. "Do you believe this incident was racially motivated?" President Traoré paused thoughtfully before responding. "I believe the incident was driven by assumptions shaped by race, yes, but also by accent, clothing, nationality, and unspoken ideas of what power should look like. To reduce it only to race would miss the broader truth. We are all susceptible to judging what we do not fully understand." A journalist from Le Monde raised a final question. "Mr. President, what do you hope will come from all of this?" President Traoré paused thoughtfully before replying, his voice calm and unwavering. "I hope it sparks conversation. I hope it leads people to confront their assumptions. I hope it reminds us that dignity isn't about demanding respect. It's about maintaining it, even when it's withheld. Most of all," he added, "I hope it inspires us to build a world where everyone is treated with dignity, not because of their title or appearance, but simply because they are human." The questions continued for nearly an hour, but throughout, President Traoré's answers remained consistent. This wasn't about blame, it wasn't about revenge, it was about growth. Personal, institutional, global. That evening, as he prepared to return to his hotel, President Traoré reflected on the whirlwind of events. The incident at the airport had been uncomfortable, even painful, but it had also become a catalyst for dialogue, for reflection, for change. His phone buzzed, a message from his chief of staff back in Burkina Faso. "Mr. President, the JFK video has now been viewed over 10 million times. People are calling it a masterclass in dignity and leadership. How do you feel about that?" President Traoré smiled gently as he typed his response. "I feel hopeful. If 10 million people witnessed someone choose dignity over outrage, then maybe we're moving in the right direction." But the story didn't end there. In the weeks that followed, the incident remained in the global spotlight. Editorials debated the implications: racial bias, diplomatic protocol, unconscious assumptions about power and legitimacy. On social media, Hashtags like Dignity First and Lead with Respect began trending, fueling conversations from classrooms to newsrooms. 3 weeks after the incident, Officer Torres received a letter at JFK. It was from a young woman in Chicago. "Dear Officer Torres, I want to thank you for the way you handled the situation with President Troy. I watched the video. I could tell you were trying to do the right thing in a complicated moment. But more importantly, I saw how your behavior changed when you understood who he was. My question is, why did it take knowing who he was for him to be treated with respect? Shouldn't dignity be the default, not something we wait to confirm before offering?" She continued, "I work in customer service. Since watching that video, I've been trying to treat every person who walks through my door the way I'd treat a president, because I realized dignity shouldn't be earned, it should be given." Torres read the letter 3 times. Then he forwarded it to his supervisor with a simple message. "This is why the Troy incident mattered. Not because of our mistake, but because we and others learned something from it." Mike Torres, now deeply impacted by what had happened, began instituting changes. He introduced new training protocols for his team, not just focused on the mechanics of airport security, but on empathy, awareness, and treating all travelers with respect. 1 month later, Torres received a small package at the airport. Inside was a copy of The Dignity of Difference by Rabbi Jonathan Sacks. Tucked inside the front cover was a handwritten note. "Dear Officer Torres, I hope this book offers perspective as you continue the conversations we began at JFK. Thank you for your professionalism and for your willingness to grow from our encounter. Ibrahim Traoré." Torres read the book from cover to cover. Its message, that respecting differences is the foundation of peace, echoed everything President Troy had modeled during those 3 tense hours in the airport. 6 months later, Torres received a promotion to Regional Training Coordinator. His first initiative was a nationwide program called Dignity First, a training series focused on balancing security with compassion. It was first piloted at JFK. Then, gradually, it expanded to airports across the U.S. In each training session, Torres told a story. The day he unknowingly detained the president of Burkina Faso, and how that experience taught him the difference between doing his job and doing it well. Meanwhile, back in Burkina Faso, President Troy continued his mission, developing infrastructure, expanding access to education, and strengthening democratic institutions. But he also kept sharing the airport story, not as a tale of injustice, but as a reminder that even fleeting moments, when met with grace, can shape lives. Exactly 1 year after the incident, President Troy stood behind another podium, this time at Georgetown University's School of Foreign Service.
The auditorium was packed. Students, diplomats, faculty, dozens who had followed his story. He began without notes. "I came here today," he said, "not to recount an embarrassment, but to share a lesson. Because 1 hour in an airport taught me more about leadership than years in office ever could." And the room listened, because they weren't just hearing from a head of state, they were hearing from a teacher of dignity. "When I was detained at JFK Airport," President Troy told the audience, "I was presented with a choice. I could respond with anger, an anger that would have been entirely justified. Or I could respond with patience, with dignity, with a commitment to turn that painful moment into something that might help others grow." He paused, scanning the young faces seated before him.
I didn't choose dignity because I'm immune to frustration or because I've transcended anger. I chose it because I believe this: how we respond to mistreatment reveals more about who we are than the mistreatment itself ever reveals about those who wronged us. A student raised her hand. Mr. President, don't you think that by responding so calmly, you let the airport security off the hook? Shouldn't there have been consequences for what they did? It was a question he'd faced many times. His response never changed. Consequences come in many forms, he said gently. Officer Torres and his team walked away from that experience changed. The airport instituted new training. Millions of people saw that video and were forced to confront their own assumptions and biases. That's accountability. That's the kind of consequence that transforms systems, not just headlines. He leaned in. If I had demanded punishment, if I had filed complaints or stirred up a diplomatic storm, maybe a few people would have been disciplined. Maybe there would have been hearings, investigations. But would anything have really changed? Would the next African leader walking through that airport be treated any differently? I'm not so sure. The student nodded, quietly taking it in. Real change doesn't begin with retribution. It begins with understanding. It begins when people choose to do better, not because they're forced to, but because they understand why doing better matters. Another student asked, "But how do you stay dignified when you're being treated unfairly? How do you not lose your temper?" President Traoré smiled softly. "Who says I didn't get angry? Of course I felt the injustice. But I also understood that my response would shape what that moment meant, whether it became just another painful memory or a lesson that might ripple outward to change others." He stood and walked closer to the front row. Dignity isn't about suppressing your emotions. It's about mastering your response to them. It's knowing that you carry within you the power to break cycles of misunderstanding instead of reinforcing them. The conversation continued for another hour. President Traoré shared stories from his time in office, his vision for Africa's future, and reflections on modern leadership. But again and again the question circled back to that airport moment, how he turned personal humiliation into public reflection. As the event came to a close, a young woman waited until the crowd had thinned. Then she stepped forward. "Mr. President," she said, her voice quiet but steady, "I'm from Somalia. I've faced discrimination because of how I look, because of how I speak. Sometimes I'm just tired of having to be the good example, tired of always having to be patient when I'm treated unfairly. Don't you ever just want to be angry? Don't you ever want to demand respect without having to earn it?" President Traoré looked at her with deep, quiet compassion. "Yes," he said softly, "I understand that exhaustion more than you know. The burden of always having to be better, of always having to rise above, of always having to prove your humanity through grace while others are free to simply exist." He paused, letting the weight of his words settle. "But here's what I've learned. When we choose dignity over outrage, when we choose understanding over retaliation, we're not doing it for them. We're doing it for us. We're refusing to let their ignorance define our worth. We're taking back the power to shape our own narrative." The young woman nodded, tears forming in her eyes. "It's not fair," he continued. "It shouldn't require dignity to be treated with dignity. But until the world learns, we still have a choice. We can allow their prejudice to make us bitter, or we can use our response to turn bitterness into a better world. He placed a gentle hand on her shoulder.
And remember, you're not alone. Every time you choose patience over fury, every time you respond to cruelty with grace, you become part of something larger, a quiet, powerful movement of people who are changing the world, one interaction at a time. As President Traoré left Georgetown that evening, his thoughts lingered on the conversation with the young Somali woman. Her words had struck a deep chord, not because they were new, but because they were painfully familiar. She had reminded him that the incident at JFK wasn't just about him. It was about everyone who had ever been misjudged by their skin, their accent, their passport, or the absence of visible power. The taxi ride back to his hotel wound through the heart of Washington, D.C., past marble monuments and glowing government buildings, each one a symbol of American power, history, and aspiration. But Troy's mind was elsewhere. He was thinking about another kind of power. The quiet kind. The enduring kind. The kind that doesn't come from rank or reputation, but how one chooses to respond when their dignity is tested. He thought about the power of grace in the face of insult, the power of understanding in the face of judgment, the power of treating every human encounter as a chance to build bridges instead of walls. 2 years later, President Traoré would be invited to speak at the annual conference of the International Association of Airport Security. His keynote, Dignity in Security, Building Trust Through Respect, would be printed, translated, and made mandatory reading for airport personnel across the globe. But on this night, as his taxi slowed in front of the hotel, Traoré wasn't thinking about accolades or policy shifts. He was thinking about simpler, quieter victories. He was thinking about Officer Torres, who now led the Dignity First training program and had sent him regular updates with pride. He was thinking about the Somali student, who had emailed him again to say she had shared her story on a podcast and inspired dozens more to speak up. He was thinking about the letters and messages that continued to pour in, stories of people who had once reacted with anger but now paused and chose patience instead. What struck him most was this: these weren't grand gestures. They were small, personal decisions made in everyday moments. But added together, they formed a movement. Each time someone chose empathy over ego, grace over resentment, dignity over retaliation, they contributed to a quiet revolution, a shift in how people saw each other, a shift in how they responded to difference, a shift toward the kind of world he believed was still possible. Change, he knew, was slow. It was frustrating. It didn't always make headlines, but it was real. And he had seen it in conversations, in new policies, in changed hearts. As he prepared for bed that night, President Traoré smiled, not out of pride, but out of hope. Hope that a 3-hour misunderstanding in an airport had grown into something far bigger than outrage. It had become a seed, planted in the hearts of millions, growing silently but steadily in classrooms, airports, offices, and homes. It had become proof that dignity, when chosen again and again in defiance of judgment, has the power to ripple across the world. And that, he realized, is the real strength of grace. It doesn't just change the moment, it changes the memory, it changes the meaning, and in time, it changes us all. Because real change, the kind that lasts, begins one person at a time, one decision at a time, one quiet moment of dignity at a time.